The serial killer who only killed criminals, Pedro Rodrigues Filho's shocking story. Justice or vengeance, law or blood. What would you do if your world was filled with crime, betrayal and violence, and the only answer was to fight fire with fire? In Brazil, one man became a ghostly executioner, a vigilante serial killer, but unlike others, his victims weren't innocent. They were drug dealers, rapists, corrupt cops and criminals. This is the true, disturbing story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, the man who claimed to kill over 100 people, all of them with criminal pasts. This is the serial killer who only killed criminals, Pedro Rodrigues Filho's shocking story. A child born into violence. Pedro Rodrigues Filho was born on July 17, 1954, in the small town of Santa Rita do Sapucaí, Brazil. But his story was destined for darkness before he even took his first steps. His skull was bruised at birth. Why? Because his own father had beaten his pregnant mother so severely it injured the unborn child. That brain trauma, it didn't go away. It may have shaped the violent urges that haunted him for the rest of his life. By age 13, Pedro showed signs of violence. He was impulsive, aggressive, and unafraid of confrontation. But his first brush with murder came just 2 years later, and it wasn't a petty fight, it was revenge. Born to kill? The science behind Pedro Rodrigues Filho's criminal mind. Imagine this. Before you're even born, your skull is already damaged. Your brain, the command center of your emotions, is altered before you take your first breath. What kind of person would you become? The skull injury that created a killer. Pedro Rodrigues Filho wasn't just born into violence. Violence was imprinted on his brain before birth. While still inside his mother's womb, his father beat her so severely that Pedro was born with a damaged skull. But how did this affect him? Was he destined to kill? Scientists have long studied how brain injuries can lead to violent behavior. When the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that controls emotions and impulses, is damaged, a person loses the ability to control their actions. This can create the perfect killer. Pedro was not alone. Many of history's most notorious serial killers suffered early brain trauma. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, had multiple head injuries as a child. Henry Lee Lucas was beaten so severely he lost an eye. John Wayne Gacy was knocked unconscious in his youth, and all of them became remorseless killers. Psychologists believe Pedro's brain damage made him impulsive, aggressive, and completely devoid of fear. He didn't hesitate to kill, whether it was his own father, criminals, or fellow inmates. But here's the real question. Was he truly born to kill, or did his violent environment push him over the edge? Was Pedro Rodrigues Filho an unstoppable force of nature, or the product of an unforgiving world? The answer may never be clear, but one thing is certain. His brain was wired differently, and once the killing started, he never looked back. His first murder, a mission of vengeance. At 14, Pedro's father, a security guard, was falsely accused of stealing food from the school where he worked. The real thief, another guard. But Pedro didn't wait for police or lawyers. No, he took justice into his own hands. He tracked the accuser down and shot him dead. One bullet, one death, one twisted sense of justice awakened. It was also at that year that he killed a town vice mayor who had fired his father from a security job, and another man who was suspected of stealing grain from his grandfather's farm. But it wasn't enough. Fueled by rage and perhaps the idea that he could be Brazil's answer to justice, Pedro began a dark crusade. The murder spree begins. Pedro fled to Mogi das Cruzes, a city near São Paulo. There, at just 17, he immersed himself in the criminal underworld, only not as a criminal, but as its grim reaper. Drug dealers, gang leaders, thieves, corrupt cops. Pedro hunted them down, killed them, one by one. He became a self-appointed vigilante killer, targeted drug dealers, gangsters, rapists, and corrupt people. He killed a local gang leader and took over his drug business. He claimed that these weren't just murders, they were executions. He saw himself as a vigilante in a lawless system. While he was interviewed by Reported, Pedro was reported to have said, "I killed people who deserved to die. I don't feel bad. They were criminals." Often said he loved killing criminals, considering himself a necessary justice enforcer. He claimed he enjoyed killing bad people, but had a soft spot for good people. He had a tattoo that said, "I kill for pleasure." And here, S, where it gets darker. He once stormed a wedding party where a known drug lord was celebrating and slaughtered 7 people in broad daylight. Love, loss, and ruthless vengeance. Even killers fall in love. Pedro met a woman named Maria Olympia. She accepted him, despite knowing who he was. But love in Pedro's world was doomed. Who was Maria Aparecida Olympia? There is very little publicly documented information about Maria Aparecida Olympia, the woman who was reportedly Pedro Rodrigues Filho's great love. However, based on Pedro's own accounts, here's the most detailed version of their story, including their relationship, her tragic murder, and the revenge spree that followed. Maria Aparecida Olympia was a young woman living in São Paulo, Brazil, in the early 1970s. She was Pedro Rodrigues Filho's first and only serious romantic partner. Some sources suggest that she may have been involved in the criminal underworld or had connections to gang members, but this is not confirmed. Her love story with Pedro Rodrigues Filho. After Pedro fled his hometown, having already committed several murders, he arrived in Mogi das Cruzes, São Paulo, and started working for a local drug gang. During this time, he met Maria, and they quickly fell in love. Maria became his closest companion, and according to Pedro, she was the only person he ever truly loved. They lived together, and she knew about Pedro's violent past, but stayed by his side. The murder of Maria Aparecida Olympia. At some point, a rival gang targeted Pedro and his group. As a result of this criminal rivalry, Maria was murdered, shot and killed in cold blood. Pedro was devastated and furious, claiming that Maria was an innocent victim caught in the middle of the gang war. This was a turning point in his life. After losing Maria, he no longer cared about restraint and fully embraced his identity as a killer. Pedro's revenge massacre. They took the woman he loved, so he took all their lives. Pedro tracked down, tortured, and murdered everyone involved in Maria's killing, leading to one of the most merciless revenge sprees in Brazilian history. How did Pedro get his revenge? First, he identified the men responsible. Pedro hunted down his rivals one by one. He killed each one brutally. Using knives, guns, and his bare hands, he executed them. The wedding massacre, his most infamous revenge. Pedro crashed a wedding party where some of his enemies were celebrating. He walked in, pulled out a gun, and opened fire. 7 people were killed and 16 others were injured. It became one of the most violent revenge killings in Brazilian crime history. This was no longer just vigilante justice. It was carnage. Prison, where he kept killing. In 1973, at age 19, Pedro was finally captured. He confessed to killing over 40 people, but prison didn't stop him. It gave him new victims. Killed 47 fellow inmates in prison, including a rapist who he beheaded. He killed fellow inmates, rapists, pedophiles, murderers. His most infamous kill, his own father, who was in jail for murdering Pedro's mother with a machete. Pedro visited him, and in a horrifying act of vengeance, he stabbed his father 22 times in prison. Then he reportedly cut out a piece of his father's heart and ate it. This was no longer about justice. This was psychopathy wrapped in moral justification. How did Pedro Rodrigues Filho kill so many people in prison? Pedro Rodrigues Filho managed to kill around 40 to 47 fellow inmates while in prison. His ability to carry out these murders inside a heavily controlled environment is both terrifying and fascinating. Here's how he did it. Targeting rapists, abusers, and criminals, Pedro had a personal code. He only killed criminals he believed were evil, especially rapists, child molesters, and traitors. Brazilian prisons are notoriously overcrowded and violent, meaning there was little order among inmates, allowing for vigilante-style killings. 2. Prison gangs and inmate rivalries. Pedro quickly established himself as a feared inmate. Other prisoners avoided crossing him because they knew he had no hesitation to kill. He aligned himself with powerful prison groups, which helped him obtain weapons and stay protected. Some inmates may have helped him eliminate rivals or those they saw as threats. 3. The brutal ways he killed in prison. Stabbings, the most common method, using makeshift knives, shanks, created from toothbrushes, metal, or other objects. Strangulation. Some reports say he strangled prisoners with his bare hands. Blunt force attacks. He used whatever he could find, including food trays and improvised weapons. Beheading. He beheaded at least one inmate, reportedly a rapist, to send a message to others. 4. The infamous cannibalism rumors. Some reports claim Pedro ate parts of his victims as an act of dominance, but this has never been confirmed. His most famous prison kill was when he stabbed a rapist multiple times, ripped open his chest, and cut out his heart, then took a bite out of it. 5. Weak prison security and corrupt guards. Brazilian prisons in the 1970s-90s were extremely violent and often run by inmate gangs. Guards would sometimes look the other way, or even allowed these killings to happen to cleanse the prison of certain criminals. He was placed in isolation multiple times, but he still managed to kill again once he was back in the general population. 6. The reputation that helped him keep killing. Pedro was feared by everyone. Some inmates refused to sleep near him or requested to be transferred out. Other prisoners respected him because he was only killing the worst criminals. Some reports say that when Pedro entered a new prison, other inmates would beg to be transferred out of fear they might be next. The child rapist. Beheading. Pedro was placed in a cell with a convicted child molester. Within hours, Pedro killed and beheaded the man as an act of justice. He left the head in the middle of the cell to send a message. Prison massacre, multiple kills in one day. At one point, Pedro killed 3 inmates in a single day. He later said that one of them had looked at him the wrong way. This further solidified his reputation as a prison executioner. Life after prison. While in prison, Pedro claimed he found God and began reading the Bible. After his release in 2007, he publicly stated that he had repented for his crimes and wanted to live a peaceful life. He even started a YouTube channel where he spoke about his past, warned young people against crime, and talked about redemption through faith. Despite his religious beliefs, Pedro never showed full remorse for killing criminals. He justified many of his murders, saying he was doing God's work by eliminating evil people. Some of his interviews showed conflicted views. He spoke about faith, but also admitted he would kill again if he had to. But that wasn't the end. Still, people feared him, and rightfully so. In 2011, he was arrested again for inciting violence, but in a country plagued by corruption and crime, some still saw him as a twisted anti-hero. Death of a vigilante. On March 5, 2023, Pedro Rodrigues Filho was gunned down in Mogi das Cruzes. 2 unidentified gunmen opened fire on him and his relatives as they drove, the man who spent decades taking lives. finally had his own taken. Whether it was revenge, karma, or the end of a bloody legacy, Pedro Rodrigues Filho's story ended just as violently as it began. Pedro Rodrigues Filho claimed to be a vigilante, a killer of killers, a man who brought justice with bullets, not courts. But justice without law is just vengeance. Was he a necessary evil in a broken system, or simply a psychopath who found a moral excuse? That's for you to decide. Why was he never given the death penalty? Brazil abolished the death penalty for civilians, so Pedro was never executed. Despite committing over 70 murders, inside and outside of prison, the maximum sentence in Brazil was 30 years at the time of his conviction. He ended up serving 34 years, but was released in 2007. Why is this story so important? The story of Pedro Rodrigues Filho, Brazil's most notorious serial killer, isn't just a tale of bloodshed and revenge. It's a disturbing mirror held up to society's darkest flaws. Pedro didn't kill for money, pleasure, or power. He claimed he was eliminating criminals, murderers, rapists, corrupt officials, people he believed deserved to die. In his mind, he was a vigilante, a necessary evil. A man doing what the justice system failed to do, and that's precisely why his story is so important. It forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What happens when people lose faith in law and order? Can a murderer ever be morally justified if his victims were monsters too? Is vengeance justice, or just another form of violence? Pedro's life was shaped by a brutal environment, one filled with crime, corruption, and systemic failure. He responded to that world with violence, creating a legend that both terrified and fascinated a nation. But his legacy isn't heroic. It's tragic. His story warns us of what happens when the line between justice and bloodlust disappears. When society neglects its duty to protect, people like Pedro rise, not as saviors, but as symbols of a broken system. Whether you see him as a vigilante or a cold-blooded killer, Pedro Rodrigues Filho's story reminds us that the fight against crime must never come at the cost of our humanity. Was he a real-life Dexter? What if a serial killer only targeted other killers? What if the people he murdered were rapists, gang members, drug lords, and even corrupt cops? Pedro Rodrigues Filho, Brazil's most infamous killer, was no ordinary murderer. He claimed to have killed over 100 people, but according to him, every single one that he killed was a criminal. Nicknamed Pedrinho Matador, or Killer Petey, he started his killing spree at just 14 years old, seeking revenge for his falsely accused father. From there, he took justice into his own hands, eliminating criminals like a one-man death squad. In a world that failed to protect its people, Pedro became judge, jury, and executioner. But here's the question. Was he a real-life Dexter, a vigilante cleaning up the streets, or a cold-blooded killer who used morality as an excuse to unleash his inner monster? Even behind bars, he kept killing, murdering fellow inmates, including his own father. Yet, years later, he was released, launched a YouTube channel, and bizarrely turned into a true crime influencer. Pedro Rodrigues Filho lived and died in a world of blurred lines. Was he justice personified or evil in disguise? Let us know what you think in the comments. Was Pedro a necessary evil or just pure evil? Final thoughts. Pedro Rodrigues Filho's life forces us to confront a chilling question. When justice fails, can murder ever be justified? He claimed to be a vigilante, Brazil's answer to Dexter, but make no mistake, Pedro was no hero. Whether his victims were criminals or not, he still chose blood over the law, vengeance over justice. His story isn't just about killing criminals. It's about a man consumed by violence, shaped by a corrupt system, and eventually becoming the very monster he claimed to hunt. In the end, Pedro Rodrigues Filho didn't need to clean up society. He showed us just how thin the line is between a hero and a killer. If this story gripped you like it gripped us, don't leave without doing 3 things. Hit that like button. It tells the algorithm you want more true crime like this. Drop a comment. Was Pedro a necessary evil? Or just evil? We're reading everyone. Subscribe and turn on notifications, because we've got more shocking true crime stories coming your way every single week. And share this video with a friend who loves dark history, because some stories deserve to be remembered and warned about. This is Crime Historic Channel, and we bring you the darkest stories from history's most twisted minds. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and stay watching.